Okay. So, hi everyone, my name is Mariana Rios. I'm part of the communications team of CEsA, the Center for African and Development Studies. We are a research unit of ISEG dedicated to development studies. So if you're interested in this research area, please feel free to join us and find us on social media, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And subscribe to the CEsA Agenda, our weekly newsletter, so you can keep updated on our events and activities. I came today on behalf of CEsA Board to welcome and greet you all. Thank you for being here this evening for the second edition of the CEsA Thinks research seminars. And now I want to invite our researcher Vincent Agulonye to present his work entitled Fragilities and Shocks Effects on Communities in Eastern Africa. Vincent Agulonye holds a PhD in development studies from ISEG. At the moment, he is involved in studying development trends in Nigeria's private sector, especially in the manufacturing industry in Anambra. Vincent, please come here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
You prefer presenting
Yeah.
this way?
Yeah.
Can be this way?
Yeah.
You change here? Yes, okay.
Very good evening to everyone. Today we'll be looking at fragilities and shocks effects on communities in Eastern Africa. Fragilities and shocks. This is a subject we have been studying for the past 2-3 years now. It is an attempt to look at how events of nature, events of economic events, as well as other events that occur that affects household incomes and communities' income, and affects the lives of people living in these households and these communities. This study would be focused on Eastern Africa. Why Eastern Africa? Eastern Africa is important, or rather is important to this subject because the United Nations Climate Change Committee studied and came out with the 2021 study that the 2 or 3 major places where climate change will affect the most are Eastern Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa. These are the world most affected areas with climate change. And because of this, we will be looking at how climate change, initially this study was intended to look at households, communities, and businesses. But we have decided to restrict it to communities now so that we would have a better view of households and businesses operating in communities. Now, we would not be using the macro elements of research where we look at macro data and all that, country whole analysis now. We will limit ourselves to events within the country that affects communities. In this context, we'll be doing a brief introduction. We'll look at what communities, what we mean by communities, and what fragilities and shocks are. The relationship between shocks and fragilities would equally be looked into. We will then try to understand the geography of East Africa, and then we'll be able to look at the ripples of climate change, of conflicts, of economic and political shocks on households and in Eastern Africa. And very importantly, we'll be looking at the relationship between shocks and fragilities. Then we'll close it up with efforts that have been made at different levels to reduce these impacts. What is community? Literally, or rather from the etymology, the root word, community simply means a group of people who live together either in a geographical space, a virtual space, or share certain identity and characteristics. Meaning that these people may not be living together. If they occupy a virtual space, they are a community because they share a virtual space. Or they could be a group of people living together in a geographical location. In this context, a real place. They share certain affinity, certain closeness, and then they occupy a particular area, then they share certain characteristics together. And then if we look at, in this context, we will be referring to either people who share same language, same belief, same identity, or same history, or same hopes, or either. Today, in 50 or 100 years ago, when we talk of community, we'll be restricting ourselves to geographical space. But today, we are looking at beyond geography, virtual space. Community could be people who have never met, people who have never seen each other, but they share a virtual space. And then when we look at this, we therefore include urban areas, rural areas, these are geographical spaces, and then religious communities, professional groups, these are especially professional and social groups are usually the groups that could be referred to as the virtual spaces, the communities that share virtual spaces. And then we have farming communities and pastoral communities as communities that are shared geographical spaces. Then what is fragility itself? There has been different attempts to define or explain fragility. One important discussion of fragility intends to look at a combination of obstacles to peace, security, and sustainable development. This is one of the recent understanding of fragility. This is linked to poor governance. It is limited institutional capacity. It is also looking at, it also considers low social cohesion and weak legitimacy that leads to social contract erosion and dwindled resilience. In this context, we would be associating ourselves with thoughts where people understand fragility to mean the inability of a state or an establishment to hold social contracts, the contract responsibilities as to the people, to itself. It's fragile when the state is fragile, when the state is unable to deliver those responsibilities, those tasks, those facts, or those duties that it owes the people. And then that contract between the people and the state is broken because of the inability of the state to meet up with these responsibilities. Simply put, it is the breakdown of social contract between people and their governments. That is in the state of government. We could also have fragility in the state of communities, where the community leadership is unable to meet up with the basic expectations of the people. We could also have fragility in an institution, where the institutional leadership is unable to meet up with the expectations of the people. We could also have fragility in the state of a family, where the family is unable to meet up with the needs of his constituents. And then we could also have fragility at all levels, be it business, be it as states. It weakens ability for basic governance and development. Where fragility exists or thrives, development is slow and is weak. Then what are shocks? Shocks are in the field of development are short-term deviations from long-term trends. Short-term deviations in the sense that they are things that temporarily occur that affects the long-term expectations, long-term plan, long-term goals of a particular system. There are sudden events that affects, economically, we say there are sudden events that affect the vulnerability of a system and its components. Now, this short-term event makes the entire system vulnerable because it happens suddenly, unprepared. It takes the constituents unprepared and therefore affects their ability to live their regular lives or control their regular system. Shocks are caused usually by exogenous factors like external economic influence that affects the entire economic system, and sometimes by endogenous factors within the economic system. Sometimes this affects the endogenous systems or more, that is the entire system. Economically, shocks are events that affect household and national income. They could be positive and they could be negative. We could have a positive shock when a household, for example, the main breadwinners or the main income earners in the household experience a rise in income. We could also have a positive shock when a country has an economic boom, like oil boom, like mineral boom, like technological boom, like we have had in the US in the past 5 decades. Now, we could also have negative trends where we could have things like pandemic, the recent pandemic we all experienced rather, the conflict that could affect a particular country or region or the world. And then we also have climate change, which affects the entire world. Now, there could also be bumper harvest for those who farm, in the agricultural sector especially. And then these shocks, what relates to fragility? How do they relate to fragility, one may ask? Shocks, from our own study, we have got to realize that shocks actually are important drivers of fragility. They actually determine how fragile a system is, or how fragile a system will continue to remain. They propel inflation. They, like purchasing power parity, inequality, poverty, and suffering. A shock experienced on an income system of a family, of a community, or of a country affects the ability of the entire constituents to meet up with their usual purchasing power. Imagine the rise in wheat price since the Ukraine-Russia war has affected negatively the ability for households to purchase wheat-related products like bread, like oatmeal, like wheat meal, and so many others. These wheat-related products actually have caused inflation on wheat-related products, and therefore affected the purchasing power of households, of many households dependent on wheat-related products. And these have actually led to inequality, have brought about poverty, and have brought about suffering. That is the relationship between that single shock, the Ukraine-Russia war, and fragility. It has made these households that depends on wheat-related products fragile. Shocks also breeds hunger. It's lowering of standards and principles. It brings about corruption and lawlessness in the states. In systems where there is high poverty, in systems where there is high level of hunger, in systems where there are lowering of standards and principles, where there are high hunger, it leads to lowering of standards and principles, because people are only living for survival, not to keep a standard, not to obey the law, not to keep to what the law states, because the law of the stomach controls their thoughts and their will first. Now, shocks weaken systems and practices and institutions. Shocks fuels vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities themselves give birth to fragility. If shocks actually, you see, this actually explains the relationship between shocks and fragility. Shocks themselves, they weaken the system, they weaken practices, the way people keep to certain standards and systems. They end up creating vulnerability, because when these standards are reduced or are minimized, people are now vulnerable to anything. And because of the high rate of vulnerability, the system becomes fragile. In a state where people go to work, or let's take the judicial system, for example, the lawyers and judges go to work to administer justice, and they are hungry, and there is high crime rates, and they have the option of either helping to keep the law as it is, or helping to feed their stomach. Now, when there is high crime rate and they are struggling to keep to law standards, they are bound to reduce the standards of the law in order to meet up with the demands of their clients or people who they are prosecuting their cases. In this case, they make the judicial system fragile and vulnerable to criminal takeover. And these as systems end up increasing fragility in for example, the judiciary system, in the legal system, in the political system, and the entire state as a whole. This is the relationship between shocks and fragility. It shows that shocks themselves drive fragility, because if shocks weaken systems, by the time they weaken the economic system and then the political system, they make the state totally vulnerable and fragile. Understanding the geography of East Africa, where we are talking about beyond shocks and fragilities, having understood what shocks are and what fragilities are, and the relationship between them, we contextualize it to a particular geographical space, vis-a-vis East Africa. In East Africa is the part of Africa located at the Horn. If we take a look at the map of Africa, we would see the part where it has the curve of a horn at the right-hand corner. If you're facing it, that is the east of Africa. It encompasses the entire region where the middle, where from the middle through to from the central through to the far eastern parts. It also covers the islands around the Indian Ocean, as you can see on the slide. These countries are precisely Burundi, Comoros, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Rwanda, Seychelles, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. These are the countries that make up the eastern part of Africa. And within this parts, we have the geographical landscape. The geographical trend of Eastern Africa has it's commonly called the Horn of Africa. It has a unique landscape. It has two important mountains, Mountain Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya. And then it also has the Great Rift Valley, In fact, it also has a lake, the second deepest lake in the world, the Lake Victoria. It also has unique landscape generally. The land area, it has fresh water. I forgot the second largest freshwater lake. Sorry, the Lake Tanganyika. It's unique because it's located around the Indian Ocean. It borders around the Indian Ocean, and because of that, it's strategically located. It has the Indian Ocean on one side, and it's also cut across through the Gulf on the other end, the Gulf of Aden, and then because of that, because of its location, it is easily vulnerable to natural disaster. It's easily vulnerable to climatic change. Throughout the region, farming flourished on nutrients-rich land. This region is, because of its rich agricultural resources, it's played home to European invasion or European encounter, and this birthed the struggle during the balkanization of Africa. It's bettered the takeover of most of the countries, regions that are made up the what we have today as countries by Europeans. And we had the British on most parts of this region. We have Kenya, Tanzania, and so many of them around there were actually colonized by the British. Then we have on the far end, we have the Portuguese who colonized Mozambique. Then it's predominantly English speaking because they were mostly colonized by English speaking countries. And historically, equally, this is a region where we have one of the countries that was never colonized, Ethiopia. Ethiopia have had a strong empire over time, over history, and because of its ability to, not just Ethiopia, Sudan only had a strong empire, but Sudan was conquered, and then we have Ethiopia that was never conquered. This region is actually strategic because it has, before the European encounter, it's had the Arabian encounter. The Arabians brought trade. From trade, they went into economic colonialism, and they traded different items and then later slaves around this region, from as far up to Sudan, and then they penetrated into the west of Africa, from the north of Africa, because of the close relationship, or rather the proximity from Middle East through to the east of Africa, through to the north of Africa and east of Africa. If we look at the map again, we would see that there is, at the top end, there is Saudi Arabia through Yemen, and then from there you connect through Djibouti after the Red Sea. You see that because of that closeness, Sudan was they could easily penetrate from Saudi, Oman, Yemen, Saudi, and then through to Sudan through this after crossing the Red Sea. So that was actually the historical path of that encounter between this particular region, and the outer world. That was long before European encounter. And when during the European encounter, most of these territories were taken over by some European countries, predominantly the British in this axis, and then later on they had independence. And yet we still struggle with political realities in this region. We'll come to that later. This region, East Africa, is bedeviled by the major kind of shocks we have usually, especially climate change and environment. The 4 elements of shocks that we are interested in fragilities and shock studies. First, we look at climate change and environment, then we look at climate conflicts, and then we look at pandemic or epidemic, as the case may be, and then we look at economic shocks that are brought about by either economic or political realities, like wars, recessions, booms, and all that. These are the 4 basic elements we'll be looking at under shocks as drivers of fragility. Now, we look at first conflicts, because it's more minute compared to climate change, which has a broader effect on society. East Africa has never been without war or without conflict. It's always ripe with conflict. It is a region that have had series and keeps having series of conflicts over time, especially in recent times. Conflicts, there has been conflict over the Lemi Triangle between Sudan and Kenya. That was not resolved, but that was actually the tension was down politically, but there's also that silent conflict still going on between the 2 countries as to who owns the Lemi Triangle. There is also the Nadapal boundary dispute between Kenya and South Sudan. We know that South Sudan is a country created recently, one of the youngest country in the region, and so as in Africa. Since the creation of that country, after a long time of dispute between Sudan and the southern part, there has been dispute as to the real ownership of the Nadapal boundary. That conflict is still there, but it's down politically. There is also the dispute over Lake Malawi between Sudan and Malawi itself. Between Tanzania and Malawi, Malawi have laid claim to the fact that it is a territory because it's part of where it derived its name from. Tanzania itself, standing on historical grounds, have laid claim to that region. There is also the political dispute over the Minginu Islands between Kenya and Uganda. The 9 of the 22 states or territories in East Africa are involved in active armed conflicts since 2021, with 5 in particular: Ethiopia, which is still ongoing, Mozambique, which is still there, Somalia, which has always been there, South Sudan, which is still there, and then Sudan itself, which is still ongoing. All these countries are experiencing intense armed conflicts. Ethiopia, for example, is in a war with its northern region, the Tigray, the infamous Tigray region, and the conflicts, which began in November 2020 at the peak of the pandemic, is still undergoing, is still deeply immersed in this crisis, because it keeps reoccurring each time there is a peace path. The war has caused thousands of people deaths and humanitarian crisis, with over 350,000 people living in famine condition. The conflict has also destabilized the region, and it is still struggling. Somalia, for example, have had its own conflict since the 90s, or rather 80s. It's one of the first countries in Africa where religious terrorism began, or religious terrorism reigned supreme, because of certain issues Somalia as a country has always been having with Kenya. Somalia is a Muslim-dominated country. It is one of the Islamic hubs of this region, and because of a lot of internal issues, we're coming to climate change, but because of certain issues, it has forced itself into war with Kenya, and this, not just the attacks, these extremist attacks, rather, but it has also succeeded in penetrating its terror attacks in different regions. Some non-state actors in Somalia have succeeded in affiliating themselves with extremist groups from the onset, and because of that, they have laid attacks. They have carried out attacks successfully in Kenya and in Mozambique, even in Tanzania as well, they have had influence in the region negatively and terribly. And because of this, they have become a hub for crime. Even on the sea, beyond the regular armed conflict on land, they have equally been able to establish themselves as an important criminal spots on the sea, attacking different ships and shipping routes. And because of this, most vessels have had to either fortify themselves or avoid the routes. And this equally has affected global shipping business as well as global supply chain. Because over time, the activities of criminal pirates from Somalia have led to the loss of lives and businesses. They have hijacked ships, they have hijacked businesses, and they have hijacked luggages, or rather, they have hijacked merchandise moving from country to country. And because of that, it has actually created a bad image for the country and the region as well. Because Somalia has this proximity to the sea, it has the longest coastline in the region. Yet it still suffers from drought because of climate change related issues, as well as because of its own geography. Somalia as well is, like I did mention before, is deeply rooted in crisis as well as in civil war. It has the oldest wars, actually, like I did mention earlier, over 20 years. Since the 90s, it's over 20 years now. And it's unstable and dangerous, one of the dangerous states in the region. And it is caught in a lot of issues of insecurity. South Sudan itself, since the events leading to its independence have been have experienced crisis, and following after its independence, there was this internal squabble between the vice president and the vice, which kept the country in a long time of wars. Especially since 5 years after its independence, there was this trouble between the president Salva Kiir and the vice president Riek Machar, and this led to factions and war. It led to an ethnic war, and this ethnic war has lasted for a long time. And despite the fact that the war, which broke out in 2013, stopped midway, stopped somewhere after peace negotiations, there has still been the re-emergence of this ethnic crisis between the ethnic communities, where both of them come from and where their roots were. In Sudan itself, Sudan has been a country which experienced long-time peace during the reign of the former president Bashar until 2021. Sudan has not been completely a country of peace. It has been a country that has had periodic wars or periodic conflicts. One of the conflicts that has affected Sudan was the coup that brought about a former president, and then very recently the removal of the president after a very long time in power. He didn't want to leave, and the military forced him out of power. And since then, the country has found itself in series of protests, and then the military wanting to control the political system. And this equally has brought huge problems in the country and leading to the problem between General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the military president of the country, and then his vice, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. These two persons the General al-Burhan controls the military, while General Mohammed Dagalo controls the RSF. RSF is the Rapid Response Force that was formed as during the reign of Bashar, and because of that, over time, General Mohammed Dagalo, who has been the commander of the RSF, decided to started having issues with the military commander, and because of that, they created they created this division amongst the both of them as to power, control of power. And RSF became an opposing force to the country's military. Until now, the war is still raging. It has led to the death of several. 9,000 to 100,000 people have died, and then over 6,000 to 12,000 are injured or displaced, and lots of people are displaced rather. In Mozambique also, we've had a crisis since the Delgado attack, extremism attack or insurgency attack in 2017. Mozambique have always been a peaceful country. It's a country that was colonized by the Portuguese, and it struggled to gain independence. Yes, there was the struggle to gain independence. There was a war before independence, and after independence, it seemed calm. Until I talked about it, I discussed this last semester when we discussed Southern Africa, because Mozambique also shares a proximity with Southern Africa and finds itself as one of the Southern African countries as well as one of the countries in the East. Since the Cabo Delgado attack, Mozambique, one may tend to ask why terrorism is in Mozambique. Mozambique have always been a predominantly Christian state until the movement of trade, or that movement of migration of people from Tanzania, from Somalia originally, and then later to Tanzania, and then through the sea to Mozambique. They migrated some of them migrating due to hardship in their country, some moving businesses, because Somalia finds itself as a country that has involved in lots of criminal syndicates, and they moved drugs from country to country, and because of that, they created a kind of drug entrepot in Mozambique. Because when some of these things move around, they create a stoppage point, a point where they can bring these goods, lodge them, and retransport them. Now they created this in Mozambique, and Cabo Delgado was strategic for them. And when over time, some of them migrated innocently as usual and started doing business and started working in Cabo Delgado regions and in some villages in Cabo Delgado. And from there, they created a network of malams or imams, through which they spread their religion. And not just spreading their religion, they form criminal cells. And because of that, they were able to form a strong network of terrorists. And because of that, over the years, they have been able to launch themselves or make themselves become part of the society and accepted as citizens forcefully make themselves citizens in Mozambique, and were able to carry out this attack over time. Now, Al-Shabaab, which is very famous in Somalia itself, they created a version of theirs in Mozambique, and they had this link with ISIS, and because of that, they have been able to establish this threat to the state and create instability politically, as well as destabilize the region. One important reason why they had interest in Cabo Delgado was that Cabo Delgado was supposed to be the largest gas plant in Africa, but because of the activities of this insurgency, it has actually reduced work on site, and the dreams of the states to actualize that project is being threatened. I forgot to mention something. In Sudan, Sudan, like I said before, has been have had a history of conflict. We remember the Darfur region crisis that led the United Nations to create a special mission for Darfur. That's actually succeeded in that. The reason why Sudan's crisis today is based in two locations: Khartoum, the capital of the country, and Darfur, is because over time Darfur has formed itself to be an important point where the people of Darfur link with the Tuareg rebels of Mali and others have been able to carry out lots of anti-state activities and thereby destabilizing the region. Ripples of climate change. I would want to specify climate change to this at this point. I want to be very specific so that I'll be able to touch more things. Now, ripples of climate change, economic and political shocks on communities in East Africa. Climate change itself, like we know, is a naturally induced disaster. Africa contributes least among the countries of the world, regions of the world. Africa is the least contributor to climate change, yet it is the most suffering. It suffers the most from climate change. If you go to Kenya, there are people still burning coals in so many villages to either to keep themselves warm or to make up lights for their energy need. And this is just minute compared to what industrial nations or what industrialized nations and industrialized nations are contributing. Yet in Africa, these poor countries are the ones, these people in communities are the ones suffering the effects of climate change. Now, because of the effects of climate change, inconsistent rainfall, prolonged droughts, and all that, people have been forced to migrate. And migration has been an important issue when we talk of climate change, because people have their animals die. Pastoral communities have their animals die. They have no place to get food. They move to places where they could get pasture. And that has been the cause of conflict itself again. Now, if we look at extreme weather events like rainfall as well, Kenya, Ethiopia, and all others have not been left out in suffering the effects of floods as well. If we go to some other Eastern African countries like Seychelles and Comoros and others, they have equally had their own experiences with floods, they've equally had experiences with what do you call it? With not tsunami, this disaster, land when the earth let me get the word again. I forgot. Look at me. It happens in Portugal. It happened in Portugal recently. Earthquakes. Very good. With earthquakes. Thank you. We forget to sometimes. They've had the experiences with earthquake in the region. One would be surprised that in Africa we're hearing earthquake. Yes, in East Africa they've had the experiences with earthquake because of the like I did mention before, because of their geographical location and because of their proximity to the sea. Some of these countries have had earthquakes and terrible experiences, and these are affecting communities, these are affecting households, these are affecting incomes. We are in the context of droughts, where communities move. These people have to move to other places to set up tents or houses where they will live in temporarily, and then the children will have meal is affected. What if it is certainly affected? How they survive is actually another issue. And this actually, usually the challenge with migration in climate change context is the host community where they move to, or the owners of the land where they move to, have always resisted. And because of this fight between the owners and the settlers, it actually has led to consistent crisis, consistent conflict. And this is not just in East Africa, it is paramount in most parts of Africa where people have moved. In Nigeria, it's a huge issue. In Nigeria, it's a big issue. In Burkina Faso, it's a very big issue. I'm talking of West African countries. Oh, now when we come down to East Africa, it's a big issue in Kenya itself, especially with the Maasai. When the Maasai, who are pastoral communities, move into the territories of farming communities, it's actually a huge issue because they would fight for their crops. Farmers will fight for their crops, and then pastoralists will fight for their animals. And this actually has been a huge issue because it has actually affected the sustenance of communities. It has led to crisis, and then the states have had its own contribution to avert problems like this, but yet they still persist. There has been efforts by states to actually solve some of these problems. In Kenya, Kenya has a very ambitious program where the states have actually established a livestock insurance system where people can insure the livestock, so that in case of extreme droughts, they would get some form of compensation. How that will play out, time will tell. Now, some extreme events that have actually been recorded in this region, severe droughts, like I mentioned before. In some countries, we have consistent droughts for 2 years, no rainfall. We have had extreme droughts. We have had they've had cumulative droughts. They have had a strong rainfall. When I say strong rainfall, I mean very heavy rainfalls that have led to floods and have damaged crops. The challenge with climate change is that we all know that our weathers are patterned. Every weather has a season. In the dry season, we have prolonged rainfall, such that when the rain starts coming, they come with so much force, and then they end up causing floods and damage the little crops that are already growing. You understand? When the rain starts coming in, the farmer starts cultivating. And by the time they start cultivating, you realize that when the crops are almost at the peak of production, there is flood. And then everything is lost again. So you see, households are in this limbo where they had no food during summer or during the dry season. They had no food because everywhere was dry for a very long time. The food they had, their reserves were empty. They've exhausted their reserves. And now when the rain starts coming, they rush hopefully to start planting. And by the time they are planting, they're expecting harvest, there is flood. And everything is lost for 1 year, 2 years. And this is the reason why people migrate. Farmers move because the food that will keep them for the next year are no longer there. They harvest far less than what the yield was supposed to give. And because of this, after exhausting what they harvested, they are forced to move to places where they find alternatives. And the pastoral communities, most of them have animals. Some of these farmers have both farms and animals. And because of this, they are forced to move. And when they move to new areas, there is this clash between farmers and pastoral communities. Now, let me do a case study review of each of the countries to look at what's been happening as regards climate change in each of the countries. I'll follow them alphabetically. Let's look at Burundi. Burundi have had landslides, they've had storms, they've had droughts, prolonged droughts. They've had earthquakes. But the most disastrous shocks to Burundi has been epidemics and flood. Epidemics, they've had health disasters. Apart from the pandemic, we all know they've had other health disasters in Burundi. They've had, since 1980 to 2020, we know that Burundi was in war since 1985, and it ended only in the, it started in the mid-80s and ended somewhere around the late 90s. So they've had a persistent long period of war, and despite that, their agricultural efforts, the agricultural output has been grossly affected. Burundi, because of this, households in Burundi have had to endure this triple whammy. First, the war. Secondly, climate change, and then thirdly, the impact of landslides and others. This actually has been Burundi's path with climate change. They've had terrible experiences. If we go to Comoros, we will see very terrible experiences. So Comoros is a beautiful country, but yet it is not immune to some of this. It has had storms because of its proximity to the sea and all that. It has had storms. Storms and epidemics have equally been the major crises they've had, major shocks they've had. If we look at the volcanic activity that has happened in the country, it peaked in 2005. The country had huge volcanic activity, and this affected lands. Of course, we know that when there is volcanoes, that land for a long time will not be able to produce anything reasonable. And then when there are earthquakes as well, we see that in 2013, 2014, Comoros had its own share of earthquakes as well, and this equally affected its ability to grow crops. And this affected communities that are dependent on crops. Let me quickly state that most of these countries in East Africa are dependent on agriculture. Most of the population, a huge number of population. In Kenya, in Kenya, we have about 80. In Ethiopia, 85% of the population depends on agriculture. In Kenya, over 75% of them depend on agriculture. In Tanzania, over 80% of them depends on agriculture. In Uganda, almost 80% of the population depends on agriculture. And this gives us an understanding of what the ordinary people in the society, what the ordinary communities So other households in the communities are facing. They are faced with starvation, the threat of starvation. They are faced with the threat of living without food, no hope. Now, if we look at Djibouti is one of the small island states in the region. It's not completely an island because it has borders with other countries. It's a country that has direct access to the sea. It's not an island, rather, sorry. It's a country that has a great part of its direct with access to the sea. Yet it has had its own share of risks as well. It has had high flood activities. If you look at the slide, we will see more than half of the country have experienced terrible extreme floods because of its, like I did mention, its proximity to the sea. It's a coastal. Most parts of the country is coastal. Is a coastal region. They are bound to have floods because of increase in sea level. We know that climate change comes with high increase in sea level, and that is one of the biggest threats of climate change globally for countries living for countries with easy access to the sea or communities living close to the sea. We have this warning from the United Nations 2021 report that most communities would lose over 4 or 5% of their land to rising sea level, all associated to climate change. Cape Verde, Sao Tome, most of these countries that are island countries are at the threat of losing their lands, losing historical lands, losing territory, losing communities, entire communities to rising sea level, because sea level will rise, and because of that, these communities will have to lose their heritage, they have to move, and all that. And the worst part is that some of these things happen at night time. We've seen experiences in Ethiopia and others where some of these some landslides happen at night, where some of these floods happen in the middle of the night, and they have nowhere to run to. In the morning that night they start moving, and then by morning time they've lost everything they ever owned, and especially the historical heritage. Even the burial grounds where their corpses are buried are equally lost. Equally occupied by water, and it usually leads to cholera and other health challenges because of the exposure of decomposing bodies to water bodies. Now we look at also Eritrea. Eritrea is a country that's got its independence from both Ethiopia and Sudan. It has been immersed with crisis as well. It is a country that has less rainfall, so it's predominantly affected by droughts. They have if you look at the slide, you see that most of its disaster has been droughts, then flood, and then storm. Eritrea is a country that is closer to the Sahara, so most of its challenge has been with droughts. It's a country that has less rainfall, and it depends a lot on its neighbors. It depends a lot on its neighbors for food and others. If we look at the next, Ethiopia is one of the biggest countries in the region. 85% of its 100 million population are smallholders. It's the second most populated country in Africa. It's threatened by wars. Already we've said that before. The war in the northern parts between the Tigray and the Tigray region and the country itself almost tore the country apart in 2020, 2 years ago. And then now, since in 2020, end of 2020 to 2021, that's 2 years ago, it's almost tore the country apart. Despite the peace agreement and all that, Ethiopia is still battling war effects because most of its citizens, most of its people migrated out at the birth of the war, and they lost a lot of people to war. And yet, with climate change, the country is also battling with droughts. If we look at these small statistics there, we will see that most of its crisis, most of the shock that affected the country was droughts. And droughts in the sense that most of the crops they are used to growing, they can no longer grow because of short time of rainfall. And this has affected the ability of households to meet up with their nutritional needs of their constituents, of their members. This has affected households greatly, and they've had little experience of earthquake, and a considerable amount of pandemic, but bacterial diseases, viral disease, and parasitic disease have equally affected the country greatly. We'll look at flood as well. They've had flash floods and all that. They are not left out of landslides as well. They've had a couple of landslides, and there have been mass movements in the country because of landslides. They've also had a few volcanic activity as well. It's a country that is rich in history, and it's one of the oldest countries in the world, and yet it is still struggling to keep its citizens alive due to conflict and climate change. Kenya is one important country we cannot leave out in this region because it is at the very heart of the region. The country have had a terrible experience with climate change. They've had droughts. Droughts has been the longest and most persistent challenge they've had. They've had droughts for many, many, many months. In fact, they had a 2-year drought recently. And because of this, at the 2-year droughts, lots of people in the northern region have had to move to as far as Mozambique and some other countries around to source for livelihood. This has actually affected the country greatly. It has actually impoverished its population. Most of its people are dependent on agriculture, and because of this, most of its population are residents in rural areas, and because of that, most of them have had to move to urban areas in search of green pastures, especially the young. But the challenge is this: when we talk of households, how many people are young people? That's true. The population in Africa is predominantly young, but when we talk of migration, it is usually the men who migrate more, leaving back the women and the children. So you get to see that the impact of climate change on households affects the households more. The young men migrate, the women stay back to tend to the family and others, maybe to tend to the younger ones and the older ones. And then you see that at the end of the day, it becomes a problem for households to maintain a balance, to survive the effects of climate change. There is also the effects of a death of livestock. They've lost most of their livestock to climate change because there is no hay for the animals to feed on. And like we know, in Kenya, animals are very important historically and culturally. Their livestock is very important to them, especially with the predominant population of Maasai and other pastoral communities. They depend heavily on their animals. And with the death or with the impact of droughts, lots of animals have died. Most of them have had low birth rates, and then the farmers have equally experienced low yield in agriculture. This has resulted in household poverty, huge household poverty in Kenya, huge household poverty in Ethiopia, huge household poverty in Eritrea, huge household poverty in Somalia. That has been there for a very long time, and it's still not subsiding. If we look at Rwanda itself, Rwanda is economically one of the most prospering country, one of the economies that is growing in the region. Like Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania as some of the rising economy, but yet they are bedeviled with shocks. They have had the experience, not very good experience with shocks as well. They've had to survive droughts on their own. They've had issues with floods as well. Rural communities have had to suffer. Of course, when we talk of development, most times people concentrate more on urban communities. The attention is more on urban communities. We tend to neglect rural communities. Rural communities are the bedrock of Africa's population. In most countries in Africa, the huge population is in the rural communities. The population in city centers are usually less than the rural communities. And the impact of these natural disasters have had terrible consequences on rural communities. Then we look at Seychelles. It's a beautiful country, a small island state. It is impacted negatively by climate change. It is one of the countries that have lost land areas to rising sea level, and it is actually the economy of the country is good. It is one of the middle income countries, rather, sorry. And because of that, because of the impact of climate change on its population, Its marine ecosystem is threatened, biodiversity is threatened, and a number of things, and even including tourism is threatened. It has had floods, they've had landslides, and also they have had droughts. This has affected households. Households dependent on agriculture have been affected. Households dependent on tourism have been affected, and all that. And you see, Seychelles equally is not left out of the suffering. Somalia is one of the mostly affected. It's one of the predominantly affected country in the region. Almost, if not more than 70% of the country's population are dependent on agriculture and pastoralism. This has brought about different levels of suffering. In Somalia, they've had consistent droughts over the years. They've had over 2.9 million people internally displaced in the country. The population is internally displaced because of crisis, because of equally climate change. It is a country that has endured a long time of war. Despite its proximity to the sea, it is still suffering from climate change induced droughts. It has over 3,025 kilometers coastline in mainland Africa. It's the longest in mainland Africa. It has its worst drought from 2021, 2 years ago, till now. The country is still in droughts, and lots of households can no longer get what to eat. And when there is no food to eat, the vulnerabilities increase, and there is health challenge, and then there is crime everywhere, and there is challenge. We will look at South Sudan now. Like I did mention before, it's one of the youngest countries in the continent as well as in the world. It is a country that have experienced lots of conflicts and then lots of climate change related droughts and floods, and these both have led to high rates of hunger and malnutrition. It has also affected the country's ability to sustain itself. Fragility is very high in this country because, like other countries, it's very, very high here because of the impact of both conflict and climate change. And the country itself has had the highest level ever of conflicts that's from 2013 to 2016. It has had the highest level of food insecurity. Over the next 5 years, the government plans with its international donors and partners, it intends to build up a resilience methods to help households and communities. Let's see how far that could go in helping the community. We hope it does. Climate change induced floods have affected lots of farmlands. Every year, it has become almost an every year event, an annual event in the country. That's precarious amount of rainfall has actually affected the country, and it has had a very precarious situation. For 7.8 million of its 10.6 million population have fall short of minimum food needs, of their minimum food needs, meaning that 7 in every 10 person in South Sudan has no food to eat, has no sufficient food to eat, meaning that the country it has experienced lots of migration because of this challenge, and it is one country where they highly depend on their livestock for traditional purposes, for cultural purposes. They use livestock are used as cows especially are used as negotiating instruments for marriages, and because of this, the country recently has reported high rates of reduction in marriage because of the effects of climate change, and because the animals are no longer available for households to negotiate. Most of them have lost their animals to climate change, and most young men have moved to cities. They are unable to marry and all that. This has had huge impact on the country's ability to sustain its population in the coming years. Sudan is one country that is currently ripped in war. It is still busy with an ongoing war, yet it's still suffering from the impact of climate change. It has had long time of droughts. This has brought about hunger in families, malnutrition, child malnutrition, and adult malnutrition as well. it has brought about malnutrition in the country generally. And while its population and livestock growth has greatly reduced, it has had long time of floods and droughts. Sudan itself is a country that has a rich deposit of biodiversity, but this is actually being threatened by droughts, and the hunger that is actually ravaging its population. Due to recurring conflicts, the country has over 10 million people displaced. Most of its citizens have had to move. The city center, Khartoum, and Darfur region have had most of the population moved out of the country at the birth of this recent war. And because of this, the country is still in jeopardy. We look at Tanzania. Tanzania have experienced relative peace, yet the country is still bedeviled by climate change impacts. The country communities in the country have experienced household poverty at a very alarming rate. That despite its access to the sea and coastal communities' ability to get water from the sea, but this water, like we know, sea waters are not usually good for agriculture, and this has actually affected lots of households because of the prolonged droughts. Unlike in some parts of the world, like Europe and other smaller Western countries, where sea waters are actually treated to be able to serve agricultural purposes. In most communities in Africa, they are yet to start treating sea water for agricultural purposes. By desalinizing it, that is not very operational in most parts of Africa. And so communities have had to depend on natural sources of water, either on groundwater or rainwater to take care of the agricultural produce. And this has actually led to the reason why most communities in Africa are suffering the impact of climate change, because it's usually rain-fed agricultural system in practice, and this has actually affected the ability of households to have food, communities to also have food for their members. Tanzania is one of the countries that has a unique topography. And yet it is still, this actually is a natural resource, yet the rural communities are still dependent on, like I did mention, on rainfed agriculture. And because of the rainfed agriculture dependence, most communities and households in Tanzania, as well as most parts of Africa, are threatened by changing impacts of climate change. In Uganda, most of its 44.3 million population as of 2019 are affected by climate change, despite the economic growth in the country. It is projected that the population of the country will rise to 63.8 million by 2030 and 105.7 by 2050. This is one of the fastest growing country in population-wise. This is one of the fastest growing population in the world. Niger, Nigeria, Uganda, Ethiopia, Egypt, and others. Yet, this country, Uganda precisely, is still suffering the impact of climate change. There has been efforts to actually revive the situation, to help the situation. Yet, domestic fuel consumption has actually been affected, because most times in rural communities, households, they get their energy from burning coals and all that. And with the impact of climate change, the ability to take care of their needs becomes slimmer. And with harsher conditions like droughts, the ability to meet with their needs actually becomes more difficult. If we look at the graph we have here, we see that there has been high rates of unemployment in most parts of East Africa where we are studying. You see Burundi. In 2020, they had a very high unemployment rates. If we look at Eritrea, they have one of the highest. With Ethiopia, Ethiopia has the highest in 2020. They had the highest unemployment rates, and this seems to be subsiding, but it's still high. The unemployment rate has been very high. Most African countries have high indebted. They are predominantly highly indebted countries. because of the high debt rate and the unemployment rates, it's actually difficult. The exchange rate parity has made food importation difficult, because the food that is being imported because of high inflation and high exchange rates, they are difficult for households to afford, for people to afford, and with less jobs, with less available jobs, it becomes more difficult for people to have food on the table. And this has actually greatly affected Eastern Africa. Eastern Africa, like I did mention before, is one of the regions that's most affected with climate change, and they struggle to exist, to survive. Sorry, not to, they struggle to survive. And this is the challenge with fragility, with shocks in East Africa. They are important drivers of fragility. It shows that in the long run, this region will keep struggling with fragility. It will keep struggling with its ability to keep standards and all that. And this is the bottom of our presentation. We'll bring our discussion to an end.